A few years ago, something happened to Arch Linux that feels like it should be illegal if you're a seasoned Arch veteran. The devs actually made the distro easy to install. And no, I'm not talking about Manjaro, CatchyOS, or any of those Arch Linux spinoffs. I'm talking about the real deal Arch Linux that nerds on the internet constantly brag about using. The controversial change was Archinstall, which is a Python script that is bundled with official releases of Arch Linux that automates the setup process and makes installing Arch Linux just about as easy as installing Ubuntu. Now, the Archinstall controversy goes beyond just diminishing the glory of installing an Arch Linux system. In a way, it actually clashes with the DIY Arch Linux philosophy because the install scripts are doing all the setup work for you. And since Arch provides all the latest versions of software instead of slow, stable releases, it's much more likely that an update to something is going to cause issues on your PC versus updating a Debian-based system, for example. And if you go posting newbie questions on the Arch Linux forums when something breaks, there's a good chance that someone is going to tell you to just go read the wiki and fix it yourself, because asking how to fix Xorg on a DIY distro is like asking how to change your oil on a DIY car builder forum. But if you're relatively skilled at Linux and you just want to spin up an Archbox faster without maintaining your own setup script, then Archinstall has your back. And version 4.0 of it was recently released with an updated textual interface that looks a bit more modern than the older ncurses interface. Of course, it's still a fairly minimal command line installer because you run it off of a base Arch ISO without GTK or Qt dependencies installed, but despite the lack of, graphical niceness, it's still fairly straightforward to do as long as you just read and follow the instructions that are on the screen. Now, Archinstall ships with the distro, but it's a good idea to update it before running, just in case there has been an update to the installation script, especially if you're not using the latest Arch Linux ISO. Now, to run the install script, just type archinstall. And once the program comes up, you can use the arrow keys or you can use Vim keys J and K to traverse these menu options up and down on the left-hand side. You also have the basic navigation keys visible down here at the bottom, and you can press F1 to display this help menu on the right, which gives you the full set of navigational controls. Now, the first menu option, the Archinstall language, chooses the installer's language. Now, results may vary depending on how complete the translation you select is. And by the way, if you're ever wondering how you can contribute to open source projects without knowing how to code or do security testing, language translation is extremely valuable to promote the global adoption of these open source projects. Now, pressing escape to go back to the main menu, we have locales, and this is where you would change the keyboard layout and the language for the system that Arch Linux is going to install for you. The mirrors and repository option gives you a submenu to first choose the region of your mirrors, and typically you're just going to want to use whatever is geographically closest to you, so I'm going to use United States. Actually, I'm going to use the /filter option to get there quicker. United States, and we'll select this. And so now you can see all the mirrors here on the right-hand side that are under United States. And then you can add custom servers if you want to go with that option, and optional repositories. So this is another step that a lot of people, especially if you're going to use this as a personal PC, will want to enable multilib, because that's required for installing Steam. And everybody likes to play games on Linux, right? And you can add custom repos if that's something you want to do as well. And next we have the disk configuration. So this brings us to the partitioning submenu. And you can just use a best effort default partition layout. You might as well, because if you're doing manual partitioning, you might as well just install Arch Linux the traditional way, because that's the part that takes the longest. So go ahead and just select this as our option. And then we can choose what file system type we want to use. I'm going to stick with tradition ext4. And you can also set up your disk encryption here if you want. You just have the option of Lux encryption, so that's enabled. And you need to also make sure you set your encryption password. All right, and confirm it. And everything is good there. So now we're going to go over to swap. Well, actually, swap is enabled by default, so I'm just going to leave that configuration option. Bootloader, you can change this if you want. It uses systemd boot by default, so you could go with grub or EFI stub or whichever one you're most interested in. And next we have the kernel. So again, by default, it's going to use just the vanilla Linux kernel, and this is going to be the bleeding edge version of the kernel, because again, with Arch Linux, you're getting the latest version of every program, including the kernel. You could also do hardened if you wanted that instead, or you could do Linux LTS, or you could do Linux Zen, depending on what type of setup you're going for. I'm just going to stick with the default Linux kernel. Next, we have the host name. So by default, Arch Linux is the name that it gives you. So I'm just going to change this to Archbox, very original. And next we have authentication. So again, want to make sure you set this up for a root password. So I'm just gonna set that real quick. And don't forget to set up your user account. So add a user, enter the username, then enter a password and confirm the password. And then by default, it selects the option to make that person a super user. If you're just setting up a regular desktop system, you're most likely going to want to do this, so yes. And that's going to allow me to have access to sudo, and you can also add a new user if you wanted to at this point. So we'll confirm and exit. And then we'll go back to the profile option. So now this is where things start getting a little bit more significant. This brings you to the submenu that just says type, so enter into there. And this is where you choose the type of profile you want. So desktop is what you'll want for, well, a desktop system, if you're gonna be gaming and doing work and stuff like that. Minimal just gives you a very, very bare bones Arch Linux setup. Basically, the same thing you would get if you just went through the Arch Wiki and then you didn't install any desktop environments or anything like that. Server is kind of in between minimal and desktop. I mean, it doesn't prompt you to install a desktop environment because you don't really need one for a server. But this brings you into options for installing like SSHD and HTTP. So the type of software like web servers and things that you would typically run on a server environment. And then Xorg just gives you a minimal Xorg setup. So let's go into desktop. And I'm going to choose XFCE. You guys know I love that desktop environment. And then, depending on which one you choose, it'll then give you these options for setting up things like your graphics driver, and then also choosing which greeter you want to use. So this is like your login screen, first thing you see when you power on your computer and where you go ahead and enter in your password. So I'm going to leave these as default for now. And next we have the application section. So this is where you configure additional services like Bluetooth, audio. So this is another one you want to make sure you choose because by default, no audio server is selected and you're not going to have sound on your system. So I'll choose Pipewire for that. Print service, so you can set that up if you're going to be using a printer, and then firewall. You can choose UFW. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and choose that. And if you're wondering about how to configure UFW to make your system more secure, go ahead and watch this video that I just made about that recently. Next, we're going to get into the network configuration. So this is another very, very handy thing that Archinstall makes easier for you. Just copy the ISO network configuration to the installation. So if internet is working fine inside of this ISO, whether you're in a virtual machine like this or if you're booted off of a USB stick, if internet's working good, then this option should make sure it works when you boot into the actual Arch Linux system. Next, we have additional packages, and this is another thing that I'm not sure if it was updated in Archinstall 4.0 or some different version. I think the last time I made a video about Archinstall was when it first came out. But anyway, this has been polished quite a bit because if my memory is correct, before you had to manually type in and do like comma separated values, all of the names of the packages that you wanted to install. And obviously that's fairly flawed because you might end up typing the name of a package incorrectly, or you might genuinely type in something like Firefox, but maybe Firefox in Arch Linux isn't called Firefox. Maybe it's called Firefox-ESR or something like that. But anyway, you get the idea. But this makes it so that you can use the filter option to type in, like, well, I'll just use Firefox as an example. So you can see it right here, and then you press spacebar to choose the Firefox. And let's see, let's try something else. Let's do, well, Steam should be in here, right? Because I did choose the multi-lib. Yeah, I did. So we can select Steam here. And then you can see over here on the right-hand side, when you go back to the main menu, that Firefox and Steam are going to be installed as additional packages. Next, we'll get into the time zone. By default, it selects UTC, so just go ahead and choose your time zone for your region. And it has NTP installed by default for time sync. So we're pretty much done. The last section we have is save configuration. So this is pretty interesting because all of these settings that we just chose for this Arch Linux machine can be saved and then reproduced if you want to deploy this to more machines in the future. Maybe you're working IT in a small office or something like that, and you're tasked with setting up a bunch of Arch Linux box for the employees. That actually sounds like it'd be a really cool place to work at. So anyway, this is going to make things much easier for deploying Arch Linux boxes with the Archinstall script easier in the future, because you can just pass in these JSON files to it. So I'm going to go ahead and save all. And it also saves them both to the installation media and to the newly installed system in the same directory. So we'll take a look at that once the system is done installing. So I'll save it to var log. And yes, I'll save it there. And then do you want to encrypt the user credentials? I'll skip this, but I guess it is worth noting. Well, we'll talk about it more when we can actually see the JSON files themselves. So I won't do this for now. And let's go ahead and install. All right, and then this shows you the configuration again. This looks good to me. All right, and this will probably take a couple of minutes, so I'll most likely just fast forward it, and then we'll resume when the machine is fully set up. All right, so here Archinstall has finished in 10 minutes and 10 seconds. Not bad for installing Arch Linux. Let's exit the install and then reboot our system. All right, so we have the Arch Linux splash screen. And here we are with, I think, LightDM is the greeter we chose. And put in my password. And there you go. We've got an Arch Linux setup. We've got Steam installed. And then we'll look over this JSON file that I was telling you guys about. So let's do this. All right, var log Archinstall install log. So you can save this, and once you thoroughly test the system and you're satisfied with how it runs, you can use that to deploy machines quicker and easier. All without ever reading a single page of the Arch Wiki. But again, keep in mind that if you use Archinstall, well, for one, I don't think it's even officially a supported way to install Arch, even though it literally ships with the installation distro. But don't mess up your system and then try going to the Arch forums for help, because people are going to get annoyed with you. Especially if you have not actually read the Arch Wiki. But that's it for this video, guys. If you enjoyed it, please like and share to hack the algorithm, and check out my online store, based.win, where you can buy my awesome merch or accessories for your phone or laptop. 10% store-wide discount when you pay with Monero XMR at checkout. Have a great rest of your day.